The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gates as hundreds of protesters gathered in the main square. Their voices echoed off the ancient stone walls, carrying demands for social justice and economic reform. Among them stood Maria Santos, a young teacher who had never participated in a protest before. But the recent education budget cuts had pushed her to take action. The crowd grew larger as the hours passed. Students, workers, elderly citizens, and families joined together, holding handmade signs and chanting peacefully. The atmosphere was tense, but determined. These people had come from all corners of the city, united by their frustration with government policies that seemed to ignore the needs of ordinary citizens at the palace gates. 6 royal guards stood, at attention in their traditional red uniforms and tall black hats. They remained motionless, their faces hidden in shadow, following centuries-old protocols. The protesters kept a respectful distance, knowing that crossing certain boundaries could escalate the situation dangerously. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd's energy began to shift. What had started as organized chants became more spontaneous expressions of frustration. A group of university students began singing folk songs about freedom and justice. Their voices carried a haunting melody that seemed to touch something deep in everyone present. The lead protester, a middle-aged factory worker named Robert Chen, stepped forward with a megaphone. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke about families struggling to pay rent, students unable to afford education, and workers facing layoffs. The crowd listened intently, many wiping away tears as they recognized their own struggles and his. Words, one of the royal guards, standing third from the left, shifted slightly. It was barely noticeable, just a small movement of his head, as if he were listening more carefully to the speeches. The other guards remained perfectly still, but something had changed in the atmosphere. The rigid barrier between the protesters and the palace seemed to soften just a fraction. As evening approached, the protest showed no signs of ending. The crowd had swelled to over 1,000 people, all maintaining their peaceful stance despite growing frustration. Street vendors had arrived, selling food and water to the protesters who planned to stay through the night. Children played quietly, while their parents held vigil, creating an unexpectedly community-like atmosphere in the shadow of power. The same royal guard who had moved earlier seemed different now. His posture remained formal, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was deeply affected by what he was witnessing. The other guards began to notice his subtle changes, though none broke their own disciplined stance. News crews had arrived, setting up cameras and conducting interviews with protesters. The story was spreading beyond the palace square, reaching homes across the nation through television and social media. What had begun as a local demonstration was becoming a symbol of widespread dissatisfaction with the current government. As darkness fell, candles appeared throughout the crowd. The flickering lights created a sea of gentle flames, transforming the protest into something almost sacred. The singing continued, softer now, with lullabies and songs of hope replacing the earlier chants of demand. The mood had evolved from anger to determination. From confrontation to vigil, the royal guard who had been listening so intently throughout the day found himself deeply moved by the dignity and peaceful nature of the demonstration. These were not violent revolutionaries or dangerous agitators. They were ordinary people expressing genuine concerns about their futures and the futures of their children. Something inside him began to stir, a conflict between his duty as a guard and his humanity as a citizen. The night brought a chill that seemed to seep into everyone's bones, but the protesters remained steadfast. Blankets appeared from nowhere as neighbors and supporters arrived with supplies. The royal guard, who had been listening throughout the day, watched as elderly people shared their coats with young students, and families offered food to strangers. The sense of community was undeniable. His name was James Mitchell, though no one in the crowd knew this. He'd served as a royal guard for 8 years, following in his father's footsteps. The position was considered an honor, a symbol of loyalty and dedication to the crown. But tonight, standing in his perfectly pressed uniform while watching ordinary citizens struggle with extraordinary dignity, he felt the weight of conflicting loyalties. Behind him, through the ornate palace gates, he could see the warm lights. of the grand halls where officials debated the protesters' demands in comfortable rooms. The contrast was stark and troubling. He thought of his own family, his sister, who had recently lost her job at a textile factory, his elderly mother struggling with medical bills that seemed to grow larger each month. As dawn broke over the square, something remarkable happened. Instead of dispersing, more people arrived. They came with coffee, breakfast, and fresh flowers. The protest was transforming into something entirely unexpected. A celebration of community resilience rather than just a demonstration of frustration. A small girl, no more than 7 years old, approached the line of guards with a handful of daisies she had picked from a nearby garden. Her mother tried to call her back, but the child was determined. She walked directly to James and held up the flowers with an innocent smile that seemed to light up the entire square. James stared down at the little girl, his heart racing beneath his ceremonial armor. Protocol demanded he ignore her, maintain. His position showed no acknowledgement of the protesters. But those bright eyes looking up at him with such trust and hope made it impossible to remain unmoved. The other guards watched nervously as James faced a moment that would define not just his career, but his character. The crowd had noticed the interaction and fell silent. Hundreds of eyes focused on the scene unfolding at the palace gates. The little girl continued to hold up the flowers, waiting patiently for some response. Her mother stood frozen, realizing that her daughter had created a moment of unprecedented tension. James felt the weight of his training, his oath of service, and his duty to remain impartial. But he also felt the weight of his conscience, his connection to the community beyond the palace walls, and his recognition that the people gathered here were fighting for basic dignity and justice. The flowers trembled slightly in the child's small hands as she continued to wait. Behind the palace gates, officials had gathered at the windows to watch the confrontation. They expected the guard to follow protocol, to ignore the child and maintain the symbolic barrier between the crown and the people. Any deviation from established procedure would be seen as a breach of duty, possibly resulting in dismissal and disgrace. The other guards maintained their positions, but James could sense their tension. They were all watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Some hoped he would follow orders and maintain tradition. Others, perhaps feeling the same internal conflict, quietly hoped he might find the courage to respond to the child's innocent gesture. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the square. The moment stretched on, filled with possibility and danger. The little girl's mother took a tentative step forward, ready to retrieve her daughter if necessary. But something in the guard's posture had changed, something that suggested a decision was being made that would surprise everyone present. James looked around at the sea of faces, all watching and waiting. He saw teachers like his sister, workers like his neighbors, families like his own. These were not enemies of the state, but citizens seeking to be heard. The flowers in the child's hands seemed to represent something pure and hopeful in a situation that had become defined by rigid protocols and institutional barriers. The silence stretched across the square like a held breath. James looked down at the little girl's upturned face, her eyes sparkling with hope and innocence. In that moment, 8 years of rigid military training collided with a lifetime of human compassion. The flowers she offered seemed to bridge to worlds that had been artificially separated by protocol and tradition. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, James began to move. His gloved hand reached toward the child, breaking centuries of established protocol. The other guards stiffened, unsure whether to intervene or maintain their own positions. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. James accepted the flowers from the little girl's tiny hands. The simple gesture sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd and the officials watching. From behind palace windows, he held the daisies carefully, as if they were the most precious objects in the world, and for a brief moment, his stern expression softened into something resembling a smile. The little girl clapped her hands with delight and skipped back to her mother, who stood with tears streaming down her face. The crowd erupted in gentle applause, not triumphant or mocking, but filled with genuine appreciation for a moment of human connection that transcended institutional barriers. But James was not finished. Still holding the flowers, he took another, unprecedented step. He removed his tall ceremonial hat and placed it on the ground beside him. The other guards watched in shock as their colleague abandoned the rigid posture that defined their role. Palace officials behind the gates began making urgent phone calls, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented breach of protocol. What happened next would be remembered for generations. James began to speak, his voice carrying clearly across the square, despite the fact that guards were never supposed to address protesters directly. His words were simple but powerful, acknowledging the dignity and peaceful nature of the demonstration, and expressing his personal respect for their commitment to justice. The crowd listened in stunned silence, as this symbol of institutional authority validated their struggle. James spoke about his own family's challenges, his sister's unemployment, his mother's medical bills. He revealed himself not as an untouchable representative of power, but as a fellow citizen who understood their pain and frustration. His fellow guards faced an impossible situation. Their training demanded they maintain position and discipline, but their colleagues' actions were creating a moment of such genuine human connection that intervening seemed almost cruel. One by one, they began to make their own choices about how to respond to this unprecedented situation. The guard to James's left, a young man named David who had joined the service only 2 years earlier, found himself thinking about his own student loans and his girlfriend's struggle to find work. After graduation, the protesters' concerns were his concerns. Their fears were his fears. The rigid barrier between protector and protected suddenly seemed artificial and unnecessary. Palace officials were now in crisis mode, making urgent calls to superiors and consulting protocol manuals that had no provisions for this situation. Some demanded immediate action to restore order and discipline, as perhaps moved by the genuine emotion of the moment. Urged caution and understanding. James continued to hold the flowers, now speaking directly to individual protesters, asking about their specific concerns and listening to their stories with the attention and respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The little girl who had started this transformation watched from her mother's arms, somehow understanding that her simple gesture had created something beautiful and important. The morning sun climbed higher, illuminating a scene that defied every expectation and challenged every assumption about the relationship between authority and citizenship. What had begun as a standard protest was becoming a profound moment of human connection that would ripple far beyond the palace square. News crews scrambled to capture every moment, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Social media exploded with images and videos of the guard holding the flowers, his hat on the ground, speaking with protesters as equals rather than maintaining the traditional distance of authority. The ripple effect of James's actions spread quickly through the remaining guards. David, the young guard standing to his left, watched as protesters approached with their own small offerings. An elderly woman extended a thermos of hot tea, her weathered hands shaking slightly as she offered this gesture of kindness to someone she had only seen as a symbol of authority. David faced the same possible choice that had confronted James moments earlier. His training screamed at him to maintain position, but his humanity pulled him toward accepting this simple act of compassion. The elderly woman's eyes held no anger or resentment, only the gentle concern of a grandmother offering comfort to a young man standing in the cold. One by one, the other guards began to make similar choices. The third guard, a veteran named Marcus, who had served for 15 years, found himself remembering his own grandmother's kindness. When a young mother approached with homemade cookies for the guards, he couldn't maintain the rigid barrier that protocol demanded. The transformation was becoming contagious. What had started with a child's flowers was becoming a breakdown of artificial barriers between citizens and those sworn to protect them. The guards began accepting small gifts, engaging in quiet conversations, acknowledging the protesters as fellow human beings rather than potential threats. Palace officials watched in growing alarm as their symbolic line of protection dissolved into something resembling a neighborhood gathering. Emergency meetings were called, but no one seemed certain how to respond to a situation where both guards and protesters were behaving with perfect civility and mutual respect. James, still holding the original bouquet of daisies, found himself in conversation with Maria Santos, the teacher who had joined her first protest. She spoke passionately about the impact of budget cuts on her students, children who came to school hungry and left without the supplies they needed for homework. Her dedication and frustration resonated with James, who remembered his own difficult school years. The conversation attracted other protesters and guards, creating small circles of dialogue throughout the square. These weren't heated arguments or political debates, but genuine human conversations about shared challenges and common hopes. Teachers talked with guards about their families, workers shared stories about lost jobs, and elderly protesters offered wisdom gained from decades of experience. By midday, the scene had transformed completely. What had begun as a formal protest against government policies had become an impromptu community gathering. Street musicians appeared playing gentle melodies that seemed to underscore the peaceful nature of the interactions. Children played games while their parents continued their conversations with the guards. The little girl, who had initiated this transformation, returned with fresh flowers, this time offering them to each guard individually. Her innocent joy in making these connections became a symbol of hope that adults often lose, but desperately need to rediscover. Each guard who accepted her flowers seemed to shed a little more of their institutional armor and reveal more of their humanity. News reports began reaching the broader public, showing images that challenged every assumption about protests and authority. Instead of confrontation, viewers saw cooperation. Instead of anger, they witnessed understanding. The story spread across social media platforms, inspiring similar conversations in communities around the world. Government officials found themselves facing an unprecedented situation. The traditional tools for managing protests seemed irrelevant when both sides were engaged in respectful dialogue rather than confrontation. Some officials worried about the breakdown of established protocols, while others began to see an opportunity for genuine communication with concerned citizens. The guard's commanding officer arrived at the scene, expecting to find a crisis requiring immediate intervention. Instead, he discovered his men engaged in the kind of community policing that training manuals promoted but rarely achieved. The protesters were peaceful, the guards were safe, and genuine progress seemed to be occurring through simple human connection. James looked around at the transformed square, still clutching the flowers that had started everything. The rigid line between authority and citizenship had blurred into something more nuanced and ultimately more effective. The protesters felt heard, the guards felt connected to their community, and everyone present had experienced something unprecedented and hopeful. The arrival of the commanding officer created a moment of tension that rippled through the square. Colonel William Hayes had served for 30 years, rising through the ranks by maintaining strict discipline and unwavering adherence to protocol. He approached the scene, expecting to restore order immediately. But what he found challenged every assumption he held about duty and service. James stood at attention as his superior approached, but he did not release the flowers or retrieve his ceremonial hat from the ground. The other guards straightened their postures, but remained engaged with the protesters around them. The crowd watched nervously, sensing that this moment might determine whether their peaceful interactions would continue or end abruptly. Colonel Hayes surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. He saw no violence, no property damage, no threats to security. Instead, he witnessed something he had never encountered in 3 decades of service: genuine communication between authority figures and citizens. The protesters stepped back respectfully, giving him space while clearly hoping he would not destroy what they had built together. The colonel approached James directly, his expression unreadable behind years of military discipline. James prepared for the reprimand he knew he deserved according to traditional standards. But as Colonel Hayes drew closer, he noticed something unexpected in the older man's eyes, a flicker of something that might have been understanding rather than anger. Instead of immediately ordering his men back into formation, Colonel Hayes paused to observe the interactions around him. He watched David sharing photos of his family with a group of students. He saw Marcus listening intently as an elderly veteran described his own military service decades earlier. The guards were still clearly identifiable as authority figures, but they had become accessible human beings rather than untouchable symbols. Maria Santos approached the colonel with the same respectful courage she had shown throughout the demonstration. She introduced herself as a teacher and began explaining the specific concerns that had brought her to the protest. Her articulate presentation of the education funding crisis impressed the colonel, who found himself genuinely interested in her perspective rather than simply waiting for her to finish speaking. Other protesters joined the conversation, presenting their concerns with the same dignity and respect they had shown the guards. They spoke about unemployment, healthcare costs, and housing challenges, not as abstract political issues, but as personal struggles affecting real families. The colonel listened with growing understanding, recognizing that these were legitimate concerns from responsible citizens. The little girl, who had started everything, reappeared at the colonel's side, tugging gently on his uniform jacket. He looked down. She offered him a single daisy with the same innocent hope she had shown James hours earlier. The colonel stared at the flower, feeling the weight of 3 decades of rigid protocol confronting a moment of pure human connection. Palace officials continued their emergency meetings, but their urgency seemed increasingly disconnected from the peaceful reality unfolding in the square. Television news reports showed images of guards and protesters sharing food, exchanging stories, and finding common ground on issues that affected everyone in the community. Public opinion began shifting as viewers recognized the dignity and effectiveness of this unprecedented approach. Colonel Hayes found himself facing the same choice that had confronted his men. He could enforce traditional protocol and end these interactions immediately, or he could acknowledge that something valuable was occurring that transcended normal procedures. The flower in the child's outstretched hand seemed to represent not just a simple gift, but a bridge between 2 approaches to maintaining social order. The crowd watched silently as their commanding officer made his decision. He accepted the flower from the little girl with the same gravity he would show in receiving military honors. The gesture sent a clear message to both his men and the protesters that these interactions had official recognition and support. What followed surprised everyone, including Colonel Hayes himself. Instead of ordering his guards back to their posts, he asked the protesters to explain their specific proposals for addressing the issues they had raised. He listened not as an opponent to be convinced, but as a fellow citizen seeking to understand. Legitimate concerns about their shared community, the afternoon stretched on with continued dialogue, practical discussions about potential solutions, and growing mutual respect between groups that had traditionally viewed each other with suspicion. The barriers between protector and protected, between authority and citizen, continued to dissolve into something more complex and ultimately more effective than either had imagined possible. As evening approached, the square had transformed into something unprecedented in the nation's history. What had begun as a traditional protest had evolved into a model of civic engagement that would be studied and replicated around the world. The barriers between authority and citizenry had not been destroyed, or rather reimagined into something more flexible and ultimately more effective. Colonel Hayes made a decision that would define his legacy. Instead of dispersing the crowd and returning to normal protocol, requested permission to establish this as an ongoing dialogue between government representatives and concerned citizens. The palace officials, faced with overwhelmingly positive public reaction to the day's events, found themselves reconsidering long-held assumptions about how authority should interact with the people it serves. James carefully placed the original, a bouquet of daisies in a place of honor beside the palace gates, creating an impromptu memorial to the power of simple human connection. The flowers would wilt within days, but the moment they represented would endure for generations. He had risked his career for a principle he couldn't have articulated that morning, but which now seemed obvious and essential. The little girl who had started everything was lifted onto her father's shoulders for a better view of the scene she had helped create. Her innocent gesture had accomplished what years of traditional political processes had failed to achieve: genuine communication between people in power and those affected by their decisions. She waved at the guards who had become friends rather than distant symbols. Maria Santos found herself appointed as an unofficial liaison between the education community and government officials. Her passionate but respectful advocacy had impressed everyone who heard her speak, demonstrating that effective protest could be both principled and practical. The budget cuts that had brought her to the square were not immediately reversed, but processes were established for meaningful input from educators. The guards returned to their duties, but with a transformed understanding of their role in the community. They remained symbols of authority and order, but they had also become accessible human beings who understood the concerns of the people they protected. Their uniforms carried the same weight of tradition, but also a new sense of connection. To their fellow citizens, news of the day's events spread far beyond the capital city. Communities around the world began experimenting with similar approaches to civic engagement, finding ways to bridge the gaps between authority and citizenship through respectful dialogue rather than confrontational protest. The image of the royal guard holding flowers became an international symbol of hope and possibility. Colonel Hayes submitted a detailed report recommending permanent changes to guard protocols, allowing for appropriate interaction with peaceful demonstrators while maintaining necessary security measures. His 30 years of rigid adherence to tradition gave weight to his argument that effective authority required adaptation to changing social needs and expectations. The Palace Square continued to host regular community forums where citizens could present concerns directly to government representatives. The informal atmosphere established during the protests became institutionalized, creating a model for democratic engagement that balanced respect for authority with accessibility to those in power. Years later, James would often return to the spot where the little girl had offered him flowers. He had been promoted several times and had become an advocate for community policing approaches throughout the military. The daisies were long gone, but he could still remember the weight of that moment when he chose humanity over protocol. Little girl, whose name was Emma, grew up to become a diplomat specializing in conflict resolution. She often told the story of how a simple bouquet of flowers had taught her that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest gestures of human connection and mutual respect. The protest that had started with demands for policy changes had achieved something far more significant: a transformation in how authority and citizenship could interact. It became a reminder that behind every uniform, every office, and every title stands a human being capable of connection, understanding, and positive change when given the opportunity to bridge artificial barriers with authentic compassion. The flowers had wilted, but the hope they represented continued to bloom in communities around the world, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating each other with dignity and respect across the lines that too often divide us.